Beneath a moon muted by drifting clouds, the plantation lay in a stillness so complete it seemed to hold its breath, each creaking hinge and whispered shuffle a defiant tremor beneath that silence. In the heart of the slave quarter, rough hands passed from one to another, the chilling glint of iron tools, worn and repurposed, their cold edges catching brief reflections of the pale night. These were more than mere instruments of toil. They were transformed tokens of a desperate hope, sharpened by years of silent suffering and sudden resolve. Who could have guessed that within these weathered hands simmered a fire poised to break free? The air, thick with the smell of damp earth and old sweat, carried cautious murmurs, barely more than a breath, careful conversations weaving secrets under the cloak of darkness. Figures moved like shadows themselves, bodies bending low, taking care to avoid the watchful gaze of guards and overseers. Their whispered words were like sparks in dry grass, flickering fierce in that secret communion. Would these murmurs summon ruin or liberation? The night cradled both potential outcomes, pregnant with unspoken fears. Among them, a man crouched beside the crumbling hearth, his breaths shallow and deliberate, fingers trembling with a mixture of cold and resolve. A hammer, its once bright iron, dulled by years of back-breaking labor, rested near his knees. His eyes, sharp, restless, flitted toward the creaking gate that separated quarter from house. Each sound, a step too loud, or a sigh from the sentries, tightened the coil of tension winding through the group. Behind those wary gazes lay memories etched in scars and silent prayers, whispered when no ear could hear. But what had been a distant fantasy began to thicken into something dangerously real. The tools, hoes, axes, and blacksmith's hammers, battered by seasons of relentless use, were no longer mere implements of survival. They became instruments of resistance, their surfaces worn smooth in some places, jagged in others, where desperate hands had forced breaks and bends. The transformation was both physical and symbolic. To seize these was to grasp chance and agency, however fragile, against the cruel machinery of plantation law and custom. Records imply such gatherings were forbidden, punishable by whipping or worse. Yet here they were, a quiet conspiracy etched in iron and sweat. One figure leaned close enough to hear a breath hitch, signaling the arrival of footsteps that did not belong, soft yet distinct in the heavy night air. The others froze, eyes wide and bodies still as moss in a near-still forest. For moments thick with dread, the distant sounds ebb and flood like waves approaching a shore, never quite crashing, but never fully retreating. Was it a sentinel's patrol, or something more ominous? The question itself seeded a deeper unease. What did freedom demand of those who claimed it in such shadows? Whispers slipped again, firmer now, threads of fortitude woven through fear. Plans layered over shared anguish, who would strike first, where and how many might fall. The ledger leaves gaps here. Accounts vary on whether consensus or coercion bound the group, suggesting not just unity, but fractures more fragile than the night's veil. The invisible urgency grew taut with each passing heartbeat, as if the moon itself leaned closer, listening. Would they be voices heard only long after, or lost completely to time and silence? Hands gripped tools tighter, iron cold against warm, calloused skin, and eyes brightened with a dangerous light. The breath of the plantation grew heavy, loaded with expectation and the scent of smoke yet to rise. Somewhere in the distance, a loose shutter rattled, a slow prelude that stirred the dormant air. The night was no longer merely a cover, it had become an accomplice to a reckoning soon to be born. In this fragile quiet, where every whispered plan and hidden glance carried the weight of what was at stake, a storm waited, coiled and ready beneath the surface. The rough iron tools caught the moonlight once more, gleaming cold and steady, emblems of a constrained fury about to break free from centuries of bondage. Would you dare hold such a burden, knowing what must come next? The plantation's oppressive silence masked the coming tempest, but nothing could silence the storm's hunger. Not now, not ever. The night that had whispered so long in shadows finally shattered like fragile glass. The first blow fell from darkness, a sudden strike born in silence, but unyielding in its force. Near the stables where restless horses shifted uneasily, an overseer, startled by a low, unfamiliar sound, stepped into the moonless gloom. His voice barely rose before the blunt end of a hammer crashed into it, silencing years of authority in an instant. The night swallowed that brutal moment, but the tremors spread swift as wildfire through Oak Hill. No cries echoed long enough to rouse sleepers beyond a whisper. Another overseer, dragged from his slumber by chaos, now leapfrogging through the quarters, met the cold edge of a sharpened hoe before a word could humble it. Claws of old oppression were turning against their masters. Tools once wielded to bind laborers now swung with seething force. The suddenness of violence tore through the plantation's cultivated order like a storm unbound, leaving no room for reconciliation or retreat. In the manor house, where polished wood and heavy curtains had long muted the sounds of servitude, shattered glass sang its own brutal song. A scream, sharp and incomplete, fractured the tense silence before it was swallowed into the shadows. Doors that had forever marked barriers between master and servant yielded to the surge of men whose bowed heads once carried burdens in quiet desperation. The decisive moment hung frozen as Jonathan Mercer, the rigid master whose iron will had ruled these fields, stared down his fate, a pistol half raised in trembling hand, words caught somewhere between command and plea. The ledger leaves gaps here. Some accounts suggest Mercer's breath ceased before his lips parted, while others imply the final blow was an irrevocable blessing from the heavens. What is sure is the swing that ended his defiance was swift, silent, and brutally conclusive. Upstairs, more chaos erupted, furniture overturned, footsteps pounding hardwood floors, desperate cries as inhabitants scrambled for escape. Yet outside, the ring of shadows closed like steel, sealing fate with iron certainty. No one escaped the night's grim verdict. Would you recognize the sound of a shattering order? The brittle crack of civility splintering beneath years of cruelty? In that moment, Oak Hill ceased to be a plantation and became a battleground where desperation and hope merged in deadly embrace. 11 souls, men, women, and boys, tied to the merciless hierarchy, lay motionless by dawn's indifferent light. Their lives ended not in the gentle fade of sleep, but in a violent declaration. The old world's chains could be broken, even if the cost was beyond reckoning. Subtle gestures among those who took part betrayed the weight of what had transpired. Hands trembled, breaths came hard and ragged, eyes cast long shadows on a horizon that promised neither reprieve nor justice. The tools, once symbols of enduring servitude and daily survival, were discarded in careless heaps among the grass, now slick with more than mere sweat. There was no fire of triumph in those faces, only a grim, somber understanding that a line had been irrevocably crossed, a boundary beyond which life could no longer return to its former shape. Isaiah, whose silent leadership had kindled this uprising, stood apart from the chaos. His chest rose and fell beneath the weight of unspoken reckoning, his hands empty even as the world around him pulsated with violence. His gaze noted the remnants, the motionless forms, the shattered order, but there was no roar of victory, no salvo of celebration. Instead, there was quiet. The plantation stretched outward as it had before, fields rippling in the summer breeze, cicadas singing their eternal hymn. Yet beneath that veneer, something ancient and immutable had ruptured. The air thickened, carrying with it the mingled sense of blood and smoke that would linger long after the first light. Dawn did not break with the gentle kiss of morning. It seeped reluctantly, indifferent to the upheaval left in its wake. The hush that settled across Oak Hill was not peace. It was the uneasy breath between life and death, the pause before a reckoning no ledger would ever fully record. Records and rumors intertwine here, difficult to unravel with certainty. Accounts imply that by mid-morning, word of the revolt had spread beyond these shadowed fields like a dark tide. A rider, his horse collapsing feet weary beneath him, reached the county seat bearing breathless fragments of terror. The master dead, the household shattered, the plantation's order sundered. By noon, a body known as a committee of safety had gathered. men whose names were etched into every ledger and deed in Pittsylvania County. They arrived with dogs and muskets, their presence a grim promise that the land itself would betray the rebels. Who led this surge? Who swung the first blow that cracked the plantation's foundation? Questions repeated with relentless urgency became a litany of accusation. Answers, real or coerced, were demanded in voices that judged before they listened. Names were spoken that were not always true. Stories assigned like chains to shoulders too weary to resist. The method of justice was swift, brutal, and unforgiving. Those who survived learned rapidly the cost of silence or confession. Would you surrender your voice to survive the onslaught of suspicion, or raise it in defiance against an order determined to erase you? Those who resisted paid dearly, their lives extinguished or broken beyond recognition. Others vanished, swallowed by woods or river, ghosts among living men. The plantation, once a machine of profit and power, had fueled a fire that would linger in whispered legends and haunted glances for decades to come. By sunset, the rebellion had been crushed, but its shadow endured. The fields echoed anew, not with the steady rhythm of labor, but with a silence pregnant with fear, loss, and a legacy neither the overseers nor the merciless system could fully control. The echoes of the night's fury rippled through time, inscribed in wounds visible and unseen. The iron tools, abandoned where they had wrought momentary justice, gleamed cold beneath the sinking sun, silent witnesses to a night when the oppressed seized their destiny in hands once bound. The plantation would never look upon these fields the same, nor would history easily lend voice to those who dared the impossible. The order was broken, and in its fracture, a story was forever etched. The revolt, once ignited, grew with a dreadful rapidity, as if the ancient soil itself fueled the uprising's ferocity. Iron and blood commingled beneath a swollen sky, where the moaning heat pressed like a suffocating shroud across the cotton fields. Each strike of the repurposed tools rang sharp and relentless, hoes swung with a savage grace, blacksmiths' hammers crashed in desperate rhythm, axes bit deep into flesh and wood. What began as a whispered plan erupted into violent chaos, shaking the oppressive order of Oak Hill to its brittle core. The cries that tore through the sultry air were neither holy triumph nor despair, but a raw, fractured sound crossing the fragile boundary between vengeance and survival. 11 lives were lost in this fierce reckoning, men wielding iron against men wielding muskets, but there was no parity. The law of the plantation, long etched in bone and rope, bent and cracked under the weight of fierce resolve. The rebels moved like shadows made flesh, each hard breath punctuated by the clatter of metal and the groan of wounded earth beneath their flight and fury. Isaiah felt the grip of every heartbeat, the heavy thud beating against ribs as the rebellion unfolded around him. Sweat slicked his brow, his breath ragged yet steady, eyes keen for signs of faltering will or fatal mistake. Though no words bridged the chaos, each movement spoke volumes, trust, fear, hope, interwoven like the threads of coarse cloth binding calloused hands. His gaze caught a hem of red where an overseer had fallen, and for a heartbeat, the world hung poised between mercy and cold justice. What price could one place on life? The question was swallowed by the cries that now surged like wild thunder. Around him, the plantation's familiar terrain became alien, fields transformed into grim theaters of conflict, paths once trod in labor, now stained with the immediate and irrevocable marks of rebellion. Every corner and creek seemed infused with the memory of pain, yet alive with the electric pulse of newfound power. The old laws that had bound the enslaved in silent obedience were thwarted by the fierce improvisation of those wielding tools, originally meant to sustain life, now aimed to reclaim it. Yet, neither glory nor freedom came unaccompanied by doubt. The harsh light of dawn had yet to grace the fields when betrayal, like a silent blade, slashed through those fragile bonds forged in fire. Not every heart beat steady amid the frenzy. Hesitation and fear flared in the flickering eyes of some who wrestled with the brutal choice, revolt or survival. Whispers carried in the night had promised unity, but the day revealed fractures. Some sought to protect kin or favored those spared by mercy or circumstance. Trust, the fragile thread binding revolution, began to fray in the heat of consequence. Local lore holds that the fire that consumed the overseer's quarters was no accident, but a fierce beacon of wrath and despair. Flames licked at the timbers, smoke choking the heavy air, pulling tight the atmosphere like a noose around the plantation's neck. The acrid scent of burning wood and scorched earth mingled with the copper tang of blood, creating a sensory memory that would haunt Oak Hill for generations. Fire was both destroyer and purifier, its flickering light carving stark silhouettes of defiance against the night's ruin. Within the turmoil, the figure of Isaiah remained a silent fulcrum, caught between the raw surge of revolt and the heavy weight of consequence. His hands, scarred yet steady, bore the marks of countless laborious days and now deeds long thought impossible. His eyes, once cast downward in silent submission, now locked with a desperate clarity on the horizon, a horizon that promised neither safety nor victory, but demanded sacrifice. How does one lead when the line between justice and vengeance blurs in the sweat and soot of battle? Beyond the immediate carnage, the plantation's twisted legacy writhed beneath the skin of history. Laws crafted to dehumanize could not silence this night's testimony. Yet records would soon strive to erase it. The rebels' voices, loud and anguished in this moment, would be muted by the carefully ordered silence of ledgers and courtrooms. What truth remained when the iron hand of the law sought not justice, but control? Oak Hill's fields grew silent once more, but beneath the surface, the earth held the echoes of clashing metal and broken chains. Would you recognize the cost of rebellion, not only in lives lost, but in the fractures it sowed within the bonds forged in both bondage and kinship? The promise of freedom was entwined with shadows of betrayal and loss. Each fallen body marked a painful fissure in the dream of deliverance, a stark reminder that power shifted not without pain and sacrifice. The weight of these moments would settle deep in the bones of survivors and descendants alike, coloring every memory with both grief and hard-won pride. As the sun crept higher, casting long shadows across what remained of Oak Hill's battleground, the outcome crystallized. The revolt was fierce, but not free. 11 white lives lay spent, but the price paid by the enslaved was no less grave. They would carry scars beyond the skin of loss, fear, and fractured resolutions. The fields whispered of iron and blood, of a violent baptism that reshaped the contours of control and resistance. The story of that night was not just one of numbers slain, but a complex weaving of power reclaimed and futures indefinitely altered. In these hours, where the tumult of revolt softened into the uneasy quiet that follows any storm, symbols of oppression, the iron tools rested cold and silent. They bore the weight of what had come before and the burden of what was to follow. The same instruments that tethered bodies to endless labor had been turned into unexpected vessels of revolt, their scars a testament to transformation born in desperation. Iron and blood intertwined, tools of both survival and insurrection. The earth beneath Oak Hill's fields would soon swallow the night's violence, but in the iron's cold gleam and the whispered reckoning of survivors, the revolt's fire would smolder endlessly. What is left when the dust settles and the echoes fade? In the cracked surfaces of what once was, the pulse of resistance told, a grim reminder that beneath even the deepest oppression lies the fury of lives unbowed. This narration fits the chapter's intent and deepens the psychological, historical, and Gothic textures for immersive storytelling. The revolt, once ignited, grew with a dreadful rapidity, as if the ancient soil itself fueled the uprising's ferocity. Iron and blood commingled beneath a swollen sky, where the moaning heat pressed like a suffocating shroud across the cotton fields. Each strike of the repurposed tools rang sharp and relentless. Hoes swung with a savage grace, blacksmiths' hammers crashed in desperate rhythm, axes bit deep into flesh and wood. What began as a whispered plan erupted into violent chaos, shaking the oppressive order of Oak Hill to its brittle core. The cries that tore through the sultry air were neither holy triumph nor despair, but a raw, fractured sound, crossing the fragile boundary between vengeance and survival. 11 lives were lost in this fierce reckoning, men wielding iron against men wielding muskets, but there was no parity. The law of the plantation, long etched in bone and rope, bent and cracked under the weight of fierce resolve. The rebels moved like shadows made flesh, each hard breath punctuated by the clatter of metal and the groan of wounded earth beneath their flight and fury. Isaiah felt the grip of every heartbeat, the heavy thud beating against ribs as the rebellion unfolded around him. Sweat slicked his brow, his breath ragged yet steady, eyes keen for signs of faltering will or fatal mistake. Though no words bridged the chaos, each movement spoke volumes, trust, fear, hope interwoven, like the threads of coarse cloth binding calloused hands. His gaze caught a hem of red where an overseer had fallen, and for a heartbeat, the world hung poised between mercy and cold justice. What price could one place on life? The question was swallowed by the cries that now surged like wild thunder. Around him, the plantation's familiar terrain became alien, fields transformed into grim theaters of conflict, paths once trod in labor, now stained with the immediate and irrevocable marks of rebellion. Every corner and creek seemed infused with the memory of pain, yet alive with the electric pulse of newfound power. The old laws that had bound the enslaved in silent obedience were thwarted by the fierce improvisation of those wielding tools originally meant to sustain life, now aimed to reclaim it. Yet, neither glory nor freedom came unaccompanied by doubt. The harsh light of dawn had yet to grace the fields when betrayal, like a silent blade, slashed through those fragile bonds forged in fire. Not every heart beat steady amid the frenzy. Hesitation and fear flared in the flickering eyes of some who wrestled with the brutal choice, revolt or survival. Whispers carried in the night had promised unity, but the day revealed fractures. Some sought to protect kin or favored those spared by mercy or circumstance. Trust, the fragile thread binding revolution, began to fray in the heat of consequence. Local lore holds that the fire that consumed the overseer's quarters was no accident, but a fierce beacon of wrath and despair. Flames licked at the timbers, smoke choking the heavy air, pulling tight the atmosphere like a noose around the plantation's neck. The acrid scent of burning wood and scorched earth mingled with the copper tang of blood, creating a sensory memory that would haunt Oak Hill for generations. Fire was both destroyer and purifier, its flickering light carving stark silhouettes of defiance against the night's ruin. Within the turmoil, the figure of Isaiah remained a silent fulcrum, caught between the raw surge of revolt and the heavy weight of consequence. His hands, scarred yet steady, bore the marks of countless laborious days and now deeds long thought impossible. His eyes, once cast downward in silent submission, now locked with a desperate clarity on the horizon, a horizon that promised neither safety nor victory, but demanded sacrifice. How does one lead when the line between justice and vengeance blurs in the sweat and soot of battle? Beyond the immediate carnage, the plantation's twisted legacy writhed beneath the skin of history. Laws crafted to dehumanize could not silence this night's testimony. Yet records would soon strive to erase it. The rebels' voices, loud and anguished in this moment, would be muted by the carefully ordered silence of ledgers and courtrooms. What truth remained when the iron hand of the law sought not justice, but control? Oak Hill's fields grew silent once more, but beneath the surface, the earth held the echoes of clashing metal and broken chains. Would you recognize the cost of rebellion, not only in lives lost, but in the fractures it sowed within the bonds, forged in both bondage and kinship? The promise of freedom was entwined with shadows of betrayal and loss. Each fallen body marked a painful fissure in the dream of deliverance, a stark reminder that power shifted not without pain and sacrifice. The weight of these moments would settle deep in the bones of survivors and descendants alike, coloring every memory with both grief and hard-won pride. As the sun crept higher, casting long shadows across what remained of Oak Hill's battleground, the outcome crystallized. The revolt was fierce, but not free. 11 white lives lay spent, but the price paid by the enslaved was no less grave. They would carry scars beyond the skin of loss, fear, and fractured resolutions. The fields whispered of iron and blood, of a violent baptism that reshaped the contours of control and resistance. The story of that night was not just one of numbers slain, but a complex weaving of power reclaimed and futures indefinitely altered. In these hours, where the tumult of revolt softened into the uneasy quiet that follows any storm, symbols of oppression, the iron tools, rested cold and silent. They bore the weight of what had come before and the burden of what was to follow. The same instruments that tethered bodies to endless labor had been turned into unexpected vessels of revolt, their scars a testament to transformation born in desperation. Iron and blood intertwined, tools of both survival and insurrection. The earth beneath Oak Hill's fields would soon swallow the night's violence, but in the iron's cold gleam and the whispered reckoning of survivors, the revolt's fire would smolder endlessly. What is left when the dust settles and the echoes fade? In the cracked surfaces of what once was, the pulse of resistance told, a grim reminder that beneath even the deepest oppression lies the fury of lives unbowed. The fragile unity forged in blood and iron began to fray when dawn's pale light softened the harsh edges of night's fury. A brittle thread stretched too far. Among those who had wrested control from the firm grip of fear and silence, doubt crept like a silent fog, chilling the marrow of even the most determined. The uprising's pulse, once a steady rhythm of shared defiance, faltered under the weight of uncertain loyalties and the primal instinct to protect those nearest and dearest. Isaiah stood at the edge of a clearing, his chest heaving beneath the unforgiving sky. His hands, so steady in moments of rebellion, trembled now as he scanned the faces around him, some eyes sharp with resolve, others clouded by hesitation or veiled fear. The night's conspirators had transformed into a fractured assembly of hearts caught between revolt's peril and the haunting call of preservation. Whispers wound through the group, secrets slipping furtively like smoke through hollowed logs, bearing fragments of unspoken bargains and quiet betrayals. In the shadows of the slave quarters, the tangible weight of trust unraveled. Some men and women, bound by blood or shared suffering, sought to shield kin still residing in the upper house, pleading silently against the tide of violence. Others, gripped by fear of retribution beyond immediate reckoning, considered flight or surrender. The ledger holds no clear consensus, leaving only fractured memories and tangled testimonies. In the fragile break between night and morning, it became evident the unity forged in the crucible of revolt rested on a knife's edge, and the fiercest enemies may well lie within. The coppery scent of old wounds and fresh fear clung to their skin, mingling with the earthy musk of the fields, drying under the morning sun. Betrayal, though unspoken, branded the air heavier than any smoke from the burning barns. The flicker of a shadow moving apart, the reluctant glance away from hardened comrades, told stories as stark as any shouted command. In these quiet fractures, the revolt's momentum slowed, caught in the snares of hesitation and fractured allegiance. Would you weigh the cost of kin against the hungry demand for freedom? In this reckoning, the oppressive chains that bound bodies bore down, still on souls caught between love and revolt. Those spared by mercy or circumstance came to bear a burden as heavy as the whipped backs left behind, a silent witness to the costs exacted by revolt's cruel calculus. The promise of deliverance twisted, becoming a labyrinth where trust was the rarest commodity. Amid this fragile schism, the fires that had clawed hungrily at the overseer's quarters surged anew, licking the dry grain stores and tool sheds, conflagrations fed as much by desperation as by calculated fury. The acrid smoke curled skyward, black as a funeral shroud, encasing the plantation's shattered order. Flames reflected in eyes wide with fear and defiance, casting grotesque shadows that danced with the night's tormented light. This fire was no mere accident nor simple signal. It was an elemental force, a reckoning both purifying and destroying. Like a breaking heart, it consumed all it touched, carrying with it the sorrows and rage of countless souls pressed into servitude's harsh yoke. To the enslaved, the fire carved a fierce message in the night that the old world could burn to ash, and from that ash, perhaps something new might rise. But even as flames tore at the wooden bones of the plantation, the fragile bonds of rebellion snapped irreparably. Some voices faltered beneath the weight of fear, others hardened into grim resolves that would cost blood beyond the immediate night. The rebellion's heart, pulsing with fierce hope mere hours before, now lay exposed and vulnerable. Isaiah, feeling the bitter pulse of fracture within his ranks, bore a stern gaze that sought to sew splintered allies back into a single force. Yet his own eyes betrayed a tempest. Inside, a growing storm of doubt and sorrow that whispered not all who wielded an axe or hammer would shoulder the cost of revolt. The line between friend and foe blurred in sweat and smoke, transformed by fierce, irrevocable choice. The grim reckoning lay not only in the fires or the blood spilled, but in the subtle fractures, hesitations, secret glances, and the quiet calculation of self-preservation in a world that brooked no mercy for the rebellious. Across the fields, the plantation seemed a stage hosting a play scripted by desperation and betrayal, every act shadowed by the past's long reach. How does one lead when even those closest may turn away? When every whispered doubt echoes a betrayal yet unnamed? These questions haunted Isaiah as he moved through the gathering dusk, where the smoke's bitter tang still thrummed in the air like a dirge. The revolt's course was no longer marked merely by iron and blood, but by the human complexities of fear, loyalty, and shattered hope. The earth beneath Oak Hill had witnessed many burdens, but none so raw as this, a revolt born in suffering and smoldering with promise, now fractured by its own making. The night's heroes became shadows, some fleeing, others captured, and all marked by the invisible chains forged in frantic choice and desperate survival. In the waning light, the iron tools lay scattered like fallen sentinels, cold and silent, their edges dulled not by use, but by the heavy weight of fractured bonds and irrevocable decisions. They bore witness to a truth etched deep: rebellion is never a single act, but a tangled weave of courage, fear, unity, and fracture. The flames were unrelenting, fierce tongues of destruction that clawed hungrily at the night's woven fabric. What had begun as a spark of quiet defiance grew inexorably into a blaze that engulfed the heart of Oak Hill Plantation. Wood groaned and cracked beneath the merciless embrace of fire, sending up choking plumes of smoke that curled like dark serpents into the heavy air. The heat seeped into the soil and skin alike, carrying with it the unimaginable weight of grief, anger, and desperate hope. In these moments, the fire was more than destruction. It was a crucible of transformation, turning stone and timber into ash, breaking the chains of silence that had bound the oppressed to generations of unseen suffering. Each flare that licked the night was a declaration, a fierce punctuation on the page of subjugation. The acrid scent of burning wood mixed with the metallic tang of blood, a cruel reminder that beneath this blazing surrender lay the shattered lives of 11. No more than that, the countless souls bound by servitude and fury. Amidst the fury stood Isaiah, his silhouette drawn stark against the fiery glow. Sweat cascaded down his furrowed brow, stinging eyes rimmed red from the smoke, and sleepless nights that threaded together this bitter uprising. His breath came in ragged gasps, muscles tense beneath soot-streaked skin. The fire's heat did not waver him. It was a fierce comradeship in the destruction, a promise that from these ashes something might emerge both terrible and sublime. Yet in the blazing inferno, Isaiah bore the heaviest burden, the knowledge that every flame devouring the night also consumed the fragile fabric of their rebellion. The crackle of burning beams and the distant collapses of walls marked the passage of time, a gruesome metronome counting down hope and despair. Flames revealed and concealed in turns, casting grotesque, flickering shadows that danced against the plantation's skeletal remains. The trees surrounding Oak Hill throbbed with the pulse of the fire, their leaves whispering secrets stifled for ages. The night, once filled with the steady rhythm of toil and whispered prayers, now throbbed with the electric sound of destruction. Would you stand within such fire, knowing it could mean liberation? or obliteration. The rebels feared the fire's double edge, both destroyer and herald of change. The blaze shattered the old order, but endangered the very lives it sought to free. The iron tools, instruments that had wrought so much, lay discarded on scorched earth, their shapes twisted by heat and fierce labor. The tools were silent now, witnesses to a tremulous moment where hope and ruin were locked in unyielding embrace. The plantation's great barn, once a bulwark of enforced labor and control, burned the longest. Its timbers cracked and blazed like the ribs of some great beast undone by its own fury. Inside, the stores of corn and tobacco cracked and popped, releasing a wild cacophony that mingled oddly with the distant, ragged calls of those who still fled into the darkness or tended wounds now seeping crimson into dusty fields. Each snap and hiss was a reminder. This was no mere fire. It was a war in flesh, wood, and spirit. In the midst of this chaos, the betrayal whispered through those gathered grew louder still. The night's earlier fractures cracked open into exposed wounds. Some fled into the smoky veil of trees, choosing the uncertain safety of flight over the bloody certainty of battle. Others disappeared into shadows cast long by the flickering flames. The tight web of rebellion was unraveling again, thread by fragile thread. Isaiah's heart weighed heavily. This blaze was a reckoning not only of iron and blood, but of fractured souls. His hands, raw and bleeding from the uprising's toils, clenched into fists early and often, grappling with the impossible task of holding together a rebellion spun from pain and fire. His eyes, sharp and haunted, caught the silhouette of a young woman cradling a child, her face etched with terror and fierce resolve, manifestations of the human cost that no fire could consume fully. Behind the fire's roar, the night held its breath. The plantation's history, soaked in both cruelty and resistance, bore witness anew. Laws that bound bodies and minds were as fragile as the timber yielding to the flame, but neither law nor smoke could erase the memory inflicted on those who dared rise. The fire was a mirror, reflecting not only destruction, but the stubborn endurance of a people forged in hardship. As dawn began its hesitant creep over the horizon, the glow of dying embers painted the fields in cruel hues of orange and ash. The fires that had consumed and cleansed Oak Hill whispered their final farewell until the next wind. In the emerging light, the plantation was a scarred landscape, a testament to what had been lost and what might yet be reclaimed. The smoke lingered as if reluctant to leave, a tangible ghost of revolt and ruin. The iron implements, cold and twisted by their fiery baptism, remained as silent sentinels among the ashes. Their shadows stretched long, reminders that these tools carried stories beyond labor, stories of pain, defiance, and fractured hope. Each scar upon their cold surfaces was a mark of resistance etched deep into the fabric of history. The fires of Oak Hill did not merely burn buildings, they ignited a reckoning that would echo through time, a warning and a promise carved into the bones of the land. In their light, the tangled web of slavery's cruelty and humanity's fierce will to survive shimmered with a fragile, trembling beauty. The night was won and lost in flame, forever folding agony and courage into a single searing moment. The dawn brought no mercy, only the cold certainty of retribution. The flames that had consumed Oak Hill's barns and shattered its order now bore witness to a new, more relentless pursuit. The hunt, the overseer's kin, and neighboring militias coalesced with grim purpose, their muskets clipped and ready, eyes sharp with suspicion honed over years of fear. The plantation was no longer a place of work and subjugation, but a grim theater where pursuer and hunted exchanged furtive glances beneath a scorching sun. The earth, still warm with the night's fire, was trampled beneath boots, heavy with vengeance. Dogs, fierce and panting, tore through the underbrush as men followed bloodied trails, branches snapping like brittle bones under the weight of pursuit. Every crushed leaf and disturbed stone whispered of flight and fracture, of desperate footsteps seeking refuge amid the unforgiving woods. The chase was more than a physical act. It was a binding chain of fear and fury tightening around those who had dared defy the entrenched order. Isaiah moved among the trees like a shadow born of smoke and ash, silent, watchful, his breath ragged but steady, his muscles ached with exhaustion, his hands scarred from the tools that had once been instruments of labor, now weapons and talismans of survival. The weight of every loss settled heavy on his shoulders, each memory a shard of iron pressing into weary flesh. Yet the fires of revolt still burned fiercely within him, a flickering light against the encompassing darkness of pursuit. Around him, the hunted whispered in frantic tones, mapping escape routes learned from years of forced subservience amid the tangled woodlands. Their feet knew the rhythms of the forest, the soft decay of pine needles, the slick moss hiding treacherous roots, the sudden plunge of hidden ravines. The plantation's landscape, once a prison forged by iron wills and harsh deeds, offered now a grim sanctuary threaded with peril. Would freedom be found in shadows and silence, or claimed only in the cold grip of capture? The militia's fury was not merely practical, but punitive, a brutal reminder that rebellion demanded an unforgiving price. Men and women captured were dragged from the underbrush, their hands shackled, faces marked by exhaustion and terror. Some were spared immediate bloodshed, their fate sealed in the merciless courts that awaited back at the county seat. Others were not so fortunate. A whispered rumor told of executions carried out swiftly to stanch fear before it took deeper root. The ledger leaves a void where justice should have stood. Among the pursuers was the overseer, known as James Fletcher, a man whose hatred for the rebels burned as fiercely as the fires that had scarred his property. His voice barked harsh commands, cutting through the forest's uneasy murmurs, a cruel drumbeat propelling the militia ever forward. Fletcher's gaze was merciless, his wrath sharpened by fear of revolt's spread and the shattering of his tightly held control. His shadow stretched long across the path of the hunted, a human specter signaling relentless reckoning. Would you know the taste of fear that clings like smoke in the throat? The hunted learned quickly the mosaic of survival: silent footsteps, sudden stillness, the cold rush of adrenaline when muskets cracked or hounds bayed. Trust was fragile, betrayal a constant threat. Some whispered that familiar faces had turned on kinfolk in exchange for pardon or favor, weaving such tales into the bitter fabric of the hunt. Survival, it seemed, demanded the sacrifice of more than freedom. It exacted the silence of conscience. The chase stretched over days, a harrowing crucible where bodies weakened and resolve was tested to its limits. Those who escaped the first net found themselves ensnared by exhaustion, hunger, and the ever-watchful eyes of pursuers, bolstered by local fears and hatred. Yet, in the dim canopy and tangled undergrowth, flickers of resistance lived still, quiet prayers offered to the unseen forces of endurance and hope. Isaiah, weary but unbroken, bore witness to the fracture not only of body but spirit. He moved with a wary grace, aware that every breath drawn in these woods might be the last free gasp. The rebellion had stolen peace, but it had also stolen the illusion of safety. Each precious moment of hiding was a victory tempered by the knowledge that the next step might lead to chains or death. How does one endure when freedom itself becomes the shadow in every glance? As sun fell behind weary hills, the hunt pressed ever onward. The plantation, once a kingdom governed by enslaved labor and white dominion, had become a maze of fear and fugitives. The woods echoed not only with the sound of hounds and gunfire, but with the heavy silence of loss. The stories of those who fled in darkness would feed whispers for generations, stories of survival, of sacrifice, of a fury that no chain could fully contain. In the deepening twilight, the iron tools left behind glinted quietly beneath leaves and ash, forgotten relics of a fractured night where rebellion had burned bright and fierce. They waited in shadow, mute sentinels of histories lived and lost, reminders that even in flight, the spirit of resistance could never be fully captured nor silenced. After the fury of revolt and the hollow echoes of pursuit, an uneasy silence settled like a shroud over Oak Hill. The plantation, once a place of ceaseless labor and whispered endurance, now held its breath in the shadows between rumor and fact. Survivors, fugitives, and watchers moved through fractured lives, stitched together by secrecy, and whispered fears. The fire that had scorched fields and shattered order left behind a terrain of silence, overgrown with tangled memories and half-spoken stories. Within the slave quarters, voices lowered to near whispers, carrying tales fragmented by the heavy weight of danger. Oral histories took root here. Lived experiences passed carefully from one trembling lip to another, threading a delicate web of memory and survival. Some murmured of heroes lost, of narrow escapes through thorned underbrush. Others chillingly hinted at betrayals cloaked in shadows, names left unsaid but never forgotten. These whispered legends danced precariously on the edge of truth and myth, shaping a collective grief too raw for ledger or court. Archival records offer only hushed hints, official accounts scrubbed of nuance and soaked in fear. They speak of arrests and trials, condemnations rendered by white judges swift with harsh sentence and public spectacle. What they fail to capture is the tension beneath the surface of communities rent by suspicion, where trust became as elusive as freedom itself. The whispers and rumors were lifelines, threads of meaning amid the erasure that followed insurrection's defeat. Among these stories, the figure of a preacher emerges, his voice a fragile echo in a landscape eager to silence dissent. He preached not only sermons, but sermons of hope and resilience, tethering faith to stories of endurance. His words, often guarded and layered with metaphor, became a source of solace amid the swirling fog of fear. Yet even his congregation faltered, haunted by the memory of flames and the creeping dread that justice, for all its proclamations, was no friend to those who rose. Medicine, a fragile, whispered science in these quarters, offered limited reprieve. A local doctor's notes, smudged and secreted away, reveal the physical toll exacted not only by the fighting, but by the relentless fear that gnawed on nerves and bodies alike. Wounds that never fully healed, spirits that withered beneath both lash and loss. The doctor's hands, steady but haunted, witnessed the intersection of pain and perseverance, charting scars woven into the very fabric of the community. The lines between oral history and archive blur here, where spoken memories contest the cold, brittle facts of paper and ink. Legend and recorded truth remain entwined like vines fighting for light in the dense shadows. This tension embodies a broader struggle: who controls history and whose voices are allowed to endure. In these whispered testimonies and fragile memoirs lies a defiant claim that even in erasure, the truth seeps through. Hidden within these murmurs are secrets, stories of quiet resistance surviving under the watchful eyes of hardened overseers. Small acts of care, covert gatherings, stolen moments of shared humanity became the lifeblood of survival. To gather was to risk death, yet the human need to connect defied the cruel strictures imposed by the code of enslavement. Each whispered meeting was both rebellion and refuge, a tent of fragile hope amid the ruins of a burned world. Would you risk everything for a fleeting moment of solidarity, knowing that betrayal lurked as close as kin? Trust, once shattered by fear and violence, demanded cautious hands and whispered promises. Eyes that met held unspoken questions, each gaze a negotiation between hope and caution, longing and survival. In the cold aftermath, these glances were lifelines, fragile threads holding together a community unraveled by terror. The plantation itself seemed to hold its own breath, its broken walls and hollowed fields, a silent witness to everything spoken and unspoken. The groan of aged wood under shifting winds carried the weight of history, while the faint scent of smoke lingered, a ghostly reminder of fire's purging touch. The night, once a cover for revolt, now became a cloak for secrets too dangerous to voice aloud, a shadowed realm where stories both protected and endangered. As the days lengthened, the whispers grew into a fragile resistance woven of memory and faith, a tapestry embroidered with sorrow and defiance. The echoes of revolt did not end with the last flames. They lived on in stories, in muted song, in the delicate prayers uttered beneath breath and breathless fear. The legacy of Oak Hill was not simply burned fields or broken bodies. It was a quiet, persistent voice demanding to be heard beyond captivity and silence. The iron tools, once agents of labor and violence, rested in forgotten corners, cold, silent relics that carried more than scars. They bore the weight of every whispered story, every hidden gathering, every fragile dream that refused to die. In their cold gleam resides the memory of Revolt's spark and the shadows of the price paid in silence. In this crucible of survival and memory, Oak Hill lived on, not as the sum of its devastation, but as a beacon of human endurance. Its story, carried in whispered histories and fractured archives, beckons us to listen, to remember, and to bear witness to the tangled truths beneath the surface. The uprising's furious blaze left behind more than smoldering timbers and fractured lives. It ignited a reckoning that would echo through the years and etch scars deeper than any lash or iron shackle. The fires that consumed Oak Hill had burned the surface, but the chains of power and control tightened fiercely in the revolt's aftermath, binding not only bodies but spirits and futures alike in a cruel new order. The hunting party's relentless purges gave way to the cruel machinery of law and punishment. Captured rebels found themselves dragged from the tangled woods to face the cold, merciless judgment of courts well versed in stamping out insurrection. Trials were swift and harsh, words counted less than fear and spectacle, sentences carved deep into flesh and freedom, with executions designed as warnings made public spectacles. The cries silenced by muskets and gallows lingered in the air like the acrid scent of fire still curling among ash and earth. But the true devastation was more than immediate. Plantation laws grew tighter and darker, codifying fear into every aspect of enslaved life. New slave codes forbade assemblies and speech, restricting every small freedom once grasped in stolen moments. Ordinances declared even the possession of farming tools and weapons illegal, while white militias patrolled perpetually, eyes unblinking in the growing shadow of repression. The tools once wielded in revolt became symbols of dread, their very presence outlawed lest they inspire new fires. Isaiah, like so many survivors, bore witness to an altered world, a world where hope flickered dim under the unyielding weight of oppression's iron hand. The joys once found beneath whispered songs and secret gatherings became rarities, feared and hunted. The scars of the night's revolt etched themselves deeper than bruises or burns, carving wounds in the fabric of community and resistance. Life contracted into a narrow space where every breath was a risk, every glance a measured act of survival. The health of the enslaved was shattered beyond the visible. The loss of agency, the banning of communal gatherings, and the enforcement of isolation gnawed at the bodies and minds of those held captive. Accounts from the quarter reveal that sickness and despair followed swiftly on the heels of rebellion's defeat. Physical ailments abounded, wounds left to fester without care, spirits crushed beneath cruelty and isolation. The human cost of revolt's failure was written in every fatigued step, every waning breath. Yet, even in the bleakest shadow, quiet acts of defiance persisted. Faith, embodied in the preacher's words and the covert meetings, survived as a tether to dignity and endurance. Oral histories continued to thread through nights, thick with fear, preserving memory against the cold erasures of law and ledger. These whispers became an invisible revolt, a spreading ember that refused to be extinguished by lash or law. Was the savage clampdown a final chapter, or a beginning hidden within the silence? The plantation's laws may have sought to crush rebellion's roots, but in tightening every chain, they revealed the trembling fissures beneath, fissures where the desire for freedom could never be fully suppressed. The hidden strength of stories, songs, and silent resistance endured, promising renewal in the depths of despair. The iron tools, once forbidden outright, lived on in shadowed hands, symbols not just of work or revolt, but of survival's complicated art. Their cold weight spoke of human resilience, of lives tethered in bondage, yet reaching toward freedom. They were silent witnesses to a history fought and lost, but never fully silenced. Oak Hill's landscape bore witness to these struggles, forged as it was in fire and blood, shaped anew by law and silence. The revolt was stamped into the very soil, a story of violence, grief, and defiant hope. And while the shadows lengthened over the scars of that night, beneath the surface, the ember of resistance smoldered still. In the gathering shadows of aftermath and suppression, the life of Oak Hill's community split into two fragile paths, the faithful and the lost. Where despair sought to claim all, faith flickered stubbornly, a flame held high by voices that reached beyond flesh and bone, binding suffering to redemption with whispered prayers and quiet resilience. The preacher emerged from the ashes like a spectral guide, his words weaving fragile bridges between torment and hope. His sermons, laden with metaphor and sorrow, spoke not only of God's justice, but of endurance beyond earthly pain. Congregants gathered beneath him in dimly lit quarters, fingers clutching makeshift hymnals, faces illuminated by the flicker of oil lamps and trembling candles. In his voice stirred the possibility that even in the deepest shadow, there was divine witness and solace, an ember of dignity amid ashes cold and hard. Yet, even this faith bore scars, wounds invisible, carried in haunted glances and silences, thick with unspoken loss. Opposite this fragile light stood the lost, those crushed beneath fury's weight, whose bodies and spirits bore marks that no prayer could heal. Among them were the wounded rebels who escaped the hunt only to find hunted refuge within broken homes and whispered rumors. Their eyes carried the glazed sheen of pain and disbelief, hands trembling with the ghosts of violence past. The doctor in the quarter, with steady hands veined by both skill and sorrow, tended wounds visible and hidden, stitching flesh while silent grief soaked every room. Medicine was a fragile art here, a pact of quiet defiance against death's claim. Salves mixed of herbs and whispered hope, bandages wrapped as tight as the bonds of history. The doctor's ledger barely legible and secreted away, recorded wounds white law ignored, black pain left unacknowledged in official accounts. More than wounds, he tended the exhaustion etched into bones and spirits, the slow unraveling of will under weight too heavy to name. Would you find faith enough to endure when loss is a constant companion? The preacher's calm resilience held threads of comfort, but even his congregation wrestled with shadows. Some turned away from whispered prayers, lost to bitterness, or broken by grief. The community gathered to mourn beneath heavy skies, their voices a fragile chorus rising through smoke and sorrow, a testament to human endurance in a world that often denied it. The plantation's landscape, one of hardship and hope, bore witness silently. The rustle of dry leaves outside the quarter, the slow groan of settling timbers, each carried the weight of what was lost and what remained. Flame-scarred trees stood like sentinels over a land forever altered by revolt and repression. Yet beneath this scarred earth, life murmured, roots clinging, voices rising from hidden places. Amid these contrasts, faith and loss were entwined, two halves of a whole wrought in suffering and perseverance. The preacher's words and the doctor's ministrations formed twin acts of resistance, each affirming life amid death, dignity amid despair. Together, they knitted a fragile community torn by fire and fear, holding careful watch over secrets buried deep beneath the plantation's cracked soil. The iron tools, silent and cold, lay hidden yet present in every whispered prayer, every healing hand, every haunted glance. They were symbols not just of labor and revolt, but of the enduring struggle to reclaim humanity in a world bent on denial. In their muted gleam resonated the quiet determination of those who, though battered and broken, refused to be forgotten. As night deepened over Oak Hill, the fragile light of faith burned steadily in the darkness, a beacon for those lost and a refuge for those who dared to believe. Here, amidst loss and resilience, the story of Oak Hill found its heartbeat, echoing in the whispered hymns and careworn hands of a people determined to survive. The echoes of Oak Hill's violent night did not fade with dawn's first light. Instead, they shaped legacies as complex and shadowed as the charred remains scattered across its fields. The physical scars of revolt, burned barns, shattered lives, broken chains, were but the surface of wounds etched deep into the psyche of survivors and descendants. Trauma, like a shadow cast long across generations, passed silently through bones and blood, an invisible inheritance entwined with resilience and memory. Many who lived through that night bore invisible marks far heavier than the lash or musket ball. The psychological toll seeped like cold water into the marrow, fear intertwined with a fierce desire for freedom, hope burdened by loss and betrayal. Survivors carried the weight of watching friends and kin fall in violent flames and fruitless hunts, their minds shattered by trauma that defied words. Memory itself became both refuge and prison, a flickering flame that sometimes warmed and sometimes scorched. That legacy of psychological suffering extended beyond the immediate aftermath. Descendants centuries later often wrestled with shadows of inherited trauma, an enduring echo of pain compounded by systemic oppression and erasure. The deeds of ancestors were sometimes known only in flickers, fragmented stories handed down in whispers, shadows glimpsed in old photographs, or soil disturbed by forgotten graves. How does one reclaim a past so often buried under silence? Yet, with trauma came fierce survival. The human spirit, battered but unbroken, found ways to endure and transform. Acts of remembrance became acts of resistance, songs sung softly in stolen moments, stories recited beneath the breath of flickering candles, dances held in secret to honor lives lost and lives lived with unyielding strength. The scars of Oak Hill did not erase identity, they forged it anew in fire and shadow. The priests whispered prayers, and the doctor's gentle ministrations from decades before echoed still in these acts, threads connecting fractured lives across time. Such resilience was not denial, but a courage born of necessity, a refusal to be consumed by despair. It is this pulse beneath the ashes that calls us to remember more than facts or dates, to listen to the lingering heartbeat of those who fought against erasure with every breath. The plantation grounds, scarred but sacred, remain a place of reckoning. Recent efforts to honor those buried in unmarked graves seek to right wrongs left unspoken. The soil itself, disturbed and reclaimed, murmurs tales of cruelty and courage, binding past and present in solemn dialogue. The legacy of Oak Hill is neither distant history nor mere relic. It lives and breathes in the land and the people who carry its memory. Would you feel the weight of history if you walked those fields today? To step lightly amid disturbed earth and shadows is to encounter the unresolved pulse of a story still unfolding, a story of oppression, rebellion, loss, and enduring hope. The ashes of Oak Hill are soil fertile with memory, a testament that even in destruction, life insists on being told. The iron tools, resting now in quiet repose, remain symbols of this legacy, both burden and beacon. They hold the imprint of sweat and blood, the echo of hands that once toiled, then rebelled. In their cold gleam resides a narrative of pain transformed into power, a reminder that from the darkest nights rise the fiercest dawns. Oak Hill's story does not end with the ashes. It is carried forward by every voice willing to speak, every hand reaching to heal, and every heart striving to understand. The legacy of that night is a living testament, complex, painful, and luminous, a tapestry woven from both loss and unyielding strength. The land that once bore the brutal weight of Oak Hill's plantation now tells stories layered with grief, resilience, and contested memory. Time, slow and relentless, has altered the physical contours. The fields once tilled under whipcrack and blood now yield different crops. The slave quarters long since crumbled beneath the weight of years. Yet beneath this surface lies a hidden geography of history, an unmarked cartography of lives lived and lost, struggles forged in shadow, and legacies too often erased. The graves of those who labored and rebelled here are mostly unmarked, silent sentinels beneath earth, disturbed only by the soft winds or the tread of passing feet. Recent years have brought the painful work of exhumation and remembrance, as hundreds of black graves have been moved, some stirring hope for respectful honoring, others raising fierce emotions among descendants. The earth itself carries the memory of an erased people, whispering through uninscribed stones and disturbed soil, a reminder that history's wounds remain alive and present. Emancipation did not erase the chains binding Oak Hill's descendants. Many who once knew only bondage found themselves ensnared anew in systems of tenant farming and sharecropping, trades reconfigured into new forms of economic subjugation. The descendants of enslaved rebels labored on the same soil, their efforts marked by perseverance amid exploitation. From this soil, communities like Cascade grew, thriving descendants who, through tenacity and hard labor, began the difficult reclaiming of land, dignity, and self. Oral histories weave through these present-day communities, carrying the voices of ancestors who endured and resisted. The story of Major Lewis Hairston, a man born into this bondage, yet later a landowner and sawmill operator, offers a powerful glimpse into the tenacious spirit that defied erasure. His cabin stands in ruin, a stoic monument to persistence on land scarred by cruelty but still fertile with life and memory. Would you feel the weight of history in walking these grounds, where unmarked graves hold stories untold and the echoes of revolution linger in the air? The modern landscape is a palimpsest, layers of past and present overlapping in complex ways. The stories of those who lived, fought, and died here demand witness, not only as relics of a distant past, but as living legacies shaping identity, community, and the quest for justice today. There is a growing movement among descendants and scholars alike to reclaim Oak Hill from silence and spectacle. Efforts to document, preserve, and educate seek to reclaim voices lost to centuries of neglect and suppression. They challenge the sanitized narratives that have long obscured the brutal realities of slavery and revolt, demanding instead a history that acknowledges pain alongside courage, defeat alongside resistance. Iron tools, weathered by use and rebellion, remain potent symbols in this struggle, reminders that even in silence, the past's imprint is indelible. They hold the memory of hands that once braved backbreaking labor and the fierce assertion of agency that sparked revolt. In their worn surfaces lies a call to remember not only suffering but strength. The story of Oak Hill is not merely one of downfall, but of survival and reclamation. The land and its people continue to speak, insisting that history be told in full, in all its darkness, complexity, and defiant hope. Those who walk its fields today carry the burden and blessing of remembrance, the responsibility to honor a past that refuses to be forgotten. In the quiet moments between memory and forgetting, Oak Hill stands as a testament, a scarred and sacred terrain where pain and perseverance intertwine. The land remembers what the stones and ledgers often do not, preserving a legacy that challenges us to listen, to learn, and to bear witness to histories too long hidden in shadow. The tale of Oak Hill's revolt resists neat endings, folding into the murky spaces where memory, law, and history blur. The aftermath did not fall into clear lines of right or wrong, hero or villain, but rather wove a complex web of oppression, rebellion, survival, and erasure. The ledger, court records, and official accounts offer fragments, cold facts, and harsh sentences, but between their rigid lines lie shadows cast long by grief, fear, and the relentless quest for freedom. The law was a double-edged sword, wielded with precision to reassert control, even as it sought to frame the revolt as mere criminal chaos. Laws crafted in panic sharpened restrictions, black codes forbade assembly, speech, and movement, tools were outlawed, militias patrolled ceaselessly. Yet these edicts, meant to sever the uprising's roots, exposed the deep fissures beneath the plantation's veneer. The rebellion was not a single event, but a pulse running beneath the surface of a society built on violence and silence. Isaiah's story, like many others, reminds us that rebellion bore a human face marked by agonizing choices. His hands, once bound to constant labor, became instruments of revolt. Yet the cost was steep, a fracture from which there was no easy return. The blurry lines between justice and vengeance haunted those who survived, lodged deep in scars seen and unseen. Each act of defiance carried the weight of potential salvation and devastating loss. Beyond plantations and courts, the community lived with the dual legacies of resistance and repression. Oral tales competed with official histories, often contradictory and incomplete. Some remembered the revolt with fierce pride, honoring bravery and sacrifice, while others whispered caution, haunted by betrayal and shattered dreams. The tension between remembering and forgetting stretched across generations, a continual negotiation between history's erasures and its persistent truths. Would you trust a history written by those wielding power over those they oppressed? The stories passed down in whispered prayers and hidden songs challenge sanitized accounts, calling for a fuller reckoning that includes voices silenced by fear and repression. Oak Hill's revolt was not simply defiance defeated, it was a living dialogue between power and resistance, memory and forgetting. The plantation's physical ruins, collapsed dwellings, overgrown fields, mirror the tangled and contested nature of its story. The land holds traces of labor and rebellion, of the sweat and blood spilled amid dust and darkness. History has long favored the narratives of the powerful plantation owners, militias, lawmakers, casting slaves as passive victims or faceless masses. Oak Hill's revolt unsettles this narrative, asserting the agency and humanity of those who lived it. Yet the blurry lines remain, challenging us to rethink history beyond binaries, to see the complexity and nuance in a story marked by pain and fierce hope. The legacy of such rebellion reverberates still, influencing conversations about justice, memory, and identity today. Descendants grapple with inherited trauma and pride alike, working to reclaim a past too often buried beneath layers of silence and distortion. The land, the stories, and the iron tools remain touchstones for ongoing reckoning, a call to honor not just the pain, but the enduring spirit of those who dared to rise. Oak Hill's story, like many slave revolts, resists closure. Its blurred lines compel us to sit with discomfort, to hold complexity without seeking easy answers. It beckons us to listen carefully, to the ghosts in the soil, the fractures in the archives, and the whispered histories that defy erasure. In this space between memory and oblivion, Oak Hill remains a testament, a dark, luminous knot in the fabric of history where oppression and rebellion, justice and vengeance, memory and erasure collide. The landscape of revolt is not a path walked cleanly, but a tangled journey of crossing lines, breaking chains, and seeking light amid shadow.